The wind was a physical thing. It was not air. It was a wall of powdered ice moving at the speed of a freight train. Elias Thorne lowered his head, feeling the frozen needles drive into the thick wool of his coat and the exposed skin of his neck. Beside him, his horse, Copper, whinnied low in his throat, a sound of pure animal fear that was nearly snatched away by the gale. The world had vanished. There was no sky, no ground, only a shrieking horizontal blizzard that had descended upon the Dakota territory with the suddenness of a biblical plague. Elias leaned his weight into the horse, his hand gripping the thick leather of the bridle. He could not see more than 3 feet ahead. The sun had been out an hour ago, a pale, distant wafer in a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Now, there was only the roaring white. He was navigating by memory, by the subtle slope of the land his boots could feel, even through thick leather and felt liners. He was counting his steps. 112, 113. He had to get to the mound. The foolish hill. The thing they had all laughed at for 6 solid months. Copper stumbled, his great body shuddering. The cold was a predator, sinking its teeth deep into muscle and bone. Elias pulled the horse onward, murmuring words that were lost to the storm, but felt by the animal through the tension in his arm. They were close. He could feel it. The ground was rising just so. Another 20 paces. Then his boot struck something hard, something that was not rock or frozen earth. It was wood. The edge of his door frame, buried already under a drift that had not existed minutes ago. He clawed at the snow with frozen hands, his breath coming in ragged, painful bursts. He found the heavy iron latch. He pulled. The thick, sod-insulated door swung inward into blackness, and a wave of still, quiet air, smelling of earth and pine, washed over him. He shoved Copper forward, the horse needing no second command, and then stumbled in after him, throwing his shoulder against the heavy door to seal out the screaming white chaos. The world went silent. 6 months earlier, the air in the land surveyor's office had been thick with the smell of stale pipe tobacco and drying ink. Elias Thorne stood before the desk of Martin Gable, a man whose authority came from a piece of paper issued 1,000 miles to the east, and whose knowledge of the land came from books filled with straight lines and perfect angles. On the desk, between a polished inkwell and a stack of official-looking documents, lay Elias's own drawing. It was sketched on a tanned piece of hide with charcoal. It showed not a house, but a hole. "You want to build what?" Gable had asked, picking up the hide as if it were a soiled napkin. He held it at arm's length. "An earth lodge," Elias said. His voice was quiet, raspy from disuse. "A soddy, but built into the lee of the hill, not on top of it. Dug down 6 feet, with a cold sink entrance." Gable squinted at the drawing. "You mean a dugout, a burrow?" "Thorne, this is the modern age. People are building fine 2-story frame houses with milled lumber from Sioux Falls. You have a government land grant, a chance to build a proper homestead, a legacy." He gestured vaguely toward the window, where the new, raw town of prosperity was taking shape on the vast, empty plain. "I know what I'm building," Elias stated. It was not a defense, but a fact. "The regulations call for a structure of no less than 10 by 12 feet, Gable said, tapping a finger on a thick book. "It says nothing about the structure having to be underground. It's unnatural. It's what gophers do." A small smile played on his lips. He was enjoying this. The strange man who had served as a scout in the cavalry for 20 years. The man who kept to himself and spoke more to his horse than to people. had finally revealed his madness. "The wind out here has no respect for regulations," Elias said. "I've seen it strip a frame house down to its foundation in 20 minutes. I've wintered in the high country. I've seen what a real blizzard can do. It's not just the snow, it's the cold. The cold that can find its way through every crack in those fine frame houses. The cold that freezes a man in his own bed." Gable leaned back, the smile widening. "Thorn, we had a mild winter last year, and the year before. The railroad is bringing in coal. We're civilized now. We don't need to live in holes in the ground like savages." "The land doesn't know what year it is," Elias replied, his gaze steady. "It only knows cycles. I've seen the signs. The beavers are building their dams higher and packing them with more mud than I've ever seen. The squirrels' coats are thicker. The old patterns are coming back." The surveyor laughed. It was not a kind sound. "You're taking your cues from squirrels and beavers? Thorn, you're a fool. Build your hole, but don't come crying to me when the spring melt floods you out or the whole thing collapses on your head." He stamped the permit with a flourish of derision. "Thorn's folly," he muttered to his clerk as Elias turned and walked out. The name stuck. The work began the next day. It was a solitary labor, witnessed only by copper and the endless sky. He chose his site with the care of a general choosing a battlefield. It was a low, rolling hill on the north side of his quarter section, a place others had dismissed as poor for farming. But for Elias, it was perfect. The hill would serve as a massive, impenetrable wall against the prevailing north wind, the carrier of all the prairie's winter furies. He spent a week just watching the sun and the wind, marking how shadows fell and how the tall prairie grass bent. He started not by building up, but by digging down. He marked out a rectangle, 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. He broke the thick prairie sod with a spade, cutting it into uniform bricks, 2 feet long and a foot wide. He stacked these carefully to one side. They were his future walls, his insulation, his protection. The earth would be his fortress. Once the sod was cleared, the real digging began. He used a heavy pick to break the dense, dry soil and a spade to shovel it into a large cowhide scoop. He had fashioned a harness for copper, and the powerful horse would drag the scoop of earth away from the hole, depositing it in a growing pile. It was slow, back-breaking work. Man and horse working in a silent rhythm under the vast, indifferent sun. The townsfolk would sometimes ride out on their new buggies to watch the madman and his horse dig their own grave. They would point and laugh. Elias never acknowledged them. He dug down 6 feet. The earth grew cooler and damper as he went deeper. He had created a rectangular pit in the heart of the prairie. But he was not done. At the south-facing end, he dug a trench, 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, that went down another 3 feet deeper than the main floor. This was his cold sink. It was an old piece of plains wisdom, a concept alien to the builders in town. Cold air is heavy. It sinks. By having an entrance lower than the living floor, the coldest air would pool in the trench and stay there, while the warmer air remained in the main chamber. It was a simple, elegant law of physics. Next came the foundation. He spent 2 weeks hauling field stones from a creek bed a mile away, piling them onto a stone boat that Copper dragged across the prairie. He laid a 2-foot-wide foundation of these stones around the entire perimeter of the pit, mortaring them together with a mixture of clay and prairie grass. This would prevent the earthen walls from sloughing and would anchor the entire structure. The framework was the skeleton of his creation. He felled 10 thick cottonwood trees from the same creek bed choosing them for their straightness and strength. He stripped their bark and hardened the wood over a slow fire for days, a process that drove out moisture and made the timbers resistant to rot and insects. These were his main support beams. He rejected the flat roofs of the town. A flat roof was a liability, a surface for snow to accumulate on until its own weight brought it crashing down. Elias was building an arch. He set 2 massive ridgepoles down the center of the pit, supported by 4 thick posts set in the stone foundation. Then he laid the cottonwood timbers against them, their bases anchored in the foundation and their tips meeting at the ridgepole, forming a steep A-frame. He lashed them together with wet rawhide, which would shrink and tighten as it dried, creating joints stronger than any nail. The roof itself was a layered masterpiece of practical engineering. Over the timber frame, he laid a tight lattice of willow branches. On top of that, he carefully placed the sod bricks he had first cut, but this time grass side down. This created a dense, matted layer. The next layer was the most critical. He spent days puddling clay from the creek, mixing it with water and grass until it was the consistency of thick dough. He spread this clay over the sod, a full 6 inches thick, working it into every crevice. As the sun baked it, the clay became a waterproof membrane, a layer of pottery protecting his home. Finally, he began to lay the rest of the sod bricks he had saved on top of the clay, this time grass side up. He stacked them tightly, overlapping them like shingles. 2 full feet of sod bricks formed the final layer. By the time he was finished, the wooden structure had disappeared. All that remained was a long, high mound of earth, a seamless extension of the hill it was built into. In a year, the prairie grass would reclaim it, and his home would be all but invisible. It would not fight the wind. It would join the land and let the wind pass over it. The chimney was his proudest innovation. He built it from flat stones, a square flue that rose from the center of the lodge. But inside, he constructed a baffle, a stone plate that forced the smoke to travel a longer, winding path before it could exit. This allowed the stones of the chimney to absorb the maximum amount of heat from the smoke, turning the entire chimney stack into a thermal mass, a slow-release radiator that would continue to warm the lodge long after the fire had died down. He also built a separate, low-lying air intake pipe, a hollowed log that ran 50 feet underground before opening up into the lodge near the fire pit. This would provide fresh air for the fire without creating a cold draft. The interior was stark, but functional. He built a raised platform of planed logs on the northern half of the lodge. This would be his living space, elevated above the coldest air. The southern half, at the lowest level, was a standing stall for copper, complete with a manger and deep bedding of dry grass. The horse was not just a companion. He was a living furnace, and his body heat would help keep the lodge warm. The final weeks of autumn were spent stockpiling. He was not preparing for a season, he was preparing for a siege. He cut and stacked cords of dry cottonwood and ash in a long covered shed built against the eastern wall of the mound. He filled barrels with fresh water hauled from the creek. He harvested his small garden of potatoes, onions, and squash and stored them in a root cellar he dug into one wall of the lodge. He purchased sacks of flour, beans, salt, and coffee. He had crates of jerky he'd made himself and tins of lard, kerosene for his lamps, ammunition for his rifle. He was a quartermaster, preparing for a long and brutal campaign. The mockery never ceased. It became a kind of local sport. "Checking on your burro, Thorne," the ranch hands would call out as they rode past. Sheriff Miller himself paid a visit, ostensibly to check on his welfare. "It's a damn tomb, Elias," Miller had said, shaking his head as he stood inside the cool, dim space. "You can't mean to live in here. It's dark. It smells of earth." "It's safe," Elias had replied, stacking firewood against a wall. "It's warm, and it will hold." "The whole town's calling it Thorn's Folly," the sheriff said, a hint of pity in his voice. "They think the old scout's finally lost his nerve." "It's not my nerve that matters," Elias said, turning to look the sheriff in the eye. "It's my memory. People have short memories, Sheriff. The land doesn't." As autumn deepened, the signs became undeniable to anyone who knew how to read them. Elias saw them everywhere. He saw a flock of geese, confused, flying north for a day, before turning back south in a panic. He saw woolly bear caterpillars with abnormally thick black bands. He saw the prairie dogs sealing their burrows weeks earlier than usual. The air itself felt different. It was thinner, and the sky held a strange, luminous quality at sunset, a pale green that spoke of ice crystals forming high in the atmosphere. Copper felt it too. The horse grew restless, pacing in his corral, his ears twitching at sounds Elias could not hear. He would stand for hours, staring north, his nostrils flared, as if he could already smell the coming cold on a wind that had not yet begun to blow. Elias took the warnings seriously. He double-checked his supplies. He banked fresh earth against the base of his door. He was ready. The day it came, it began with deception. The morning was unnaturally still and clear. The temperature was mild. The townsfolk of Prosperity saw it as a gift, a beautiful day in late November. They called it an Indian summer. Elias knew better. He knew it was a weather breeder, the calm before the storm. He spent the morning securing everything that was loose, rechecking the harness for the snowplow he'd built. By noon, the sky in the northwest had changed. A low, dark line appeared on the horizon, as sharp and straight as if drawn with a ruler. It was not cloud. It was something else, something solid and menacing. The temperature began to drop, not gradually, but as if a door had been opened to a vast, cosmic icehouse. It fell 10 degrees in an hour, then 20. Elias did not hesitate. He led Copper from the corral. He did not need to go into town for supplies. He did not need to board his windows. He just needed to get inside. As he was making his final check, he saw his nearest neighbor, a young farmer named Miller, the sheriff's cousin, standing on his porch, staring at the approaching darkness. Miller had built a pretty 2-story frame house with a neat picket fence. He waved at Elias. "Looks like we might get a little flurry," Miller shouted, his voice cheerful. Elias just pointed to the north. "That's not a flurry," he yelled back, his voice tight. "That's the end of the world. Get your family and your animals inside, now." Miller just laughed and shook his head at the crazy old scout. Then the line on the horizon began to rise, to boil, to consume the sky. The wind picked up, a low moan that grew steadily into a piercing shriek. That was when Elias and Copper made their run. The first wave of snow hit them like a solid blow, and the world dissolved into the roaring white chaos he had sealed outside his door just moments ago. Inside the Earth Lodge, the silence was profound. The raging blizzard was reduced to a deep, muffled hum, like the sound of a distant ocean. A single kerosene lamp cast a warm, steady glow over the interior. The air was cool, but not cold, holding at a steady 50 degrees. Elias stripped off his snow-caked outer layers and hung them on pegs near the stone chimney. He rubbed Copper down with a rough cloth, the horse's body radiating a comfortable warmth that filled the stable area. He lit a small, efficient fire in the fire pit. The smoke drew perfectly up the baffled chimney. Within an hour, the stone stack was warm to the touch, and the temperature in the lodge had risen to a comfortable 65 degrees. He made coffee and ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. He sat on his raised platform, listening to the faint, distant roar of the storm that was tearing the world apart outside. The earth held. The arch held. He was safe. For 2 days, he and Copper existed in their subterranean bubble of calm. He checked his supplies, read from a worn copy of Shakespeare, and tended to the horse. The storm never slackened. Its muffled voice was a constant reminder of the fury outside. The snow would be piling up, drifting, burying everything. The cold would be unimaginable. -40, -50. A killing cold. He thought of Miller in his pretty frame house with its thin walls and single-pane windows. He thought of the town of Prosperity. On the evening of the second day, he heard a new sound. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, desperate pounding on his thick wooden door. He took his rifle and moved cautiously down into the cold sink. "Who's there?" he shouted. A voice, thin and reedy, came back, barely audible.
"Help, please. Miller. It's Miller."
Elias unbarred the heavy door. A blast of impossibly cold air and fine, stinging snow shot into the entrance. A figure, completely covered in ice, stumbled and fell into the trench. It was Miller. Behind him were his wife, clutching a small, blanket-wrapped bundle, and their young son. They were ghosts of ice and desperation. Elias dragged them in, one by one, and slammed the door shut again. They collapsed on the earthen floor, shaking, their faces blue with cold. Miller's wife was weeping, her tears freezing on her cheeks. The bundle in her arms was their infant daughter.
The stovepipe, clogged with snow,"
Miller stammered through chattering teeth.
"The house, filled with smoke. Then the cold. The windows broke. We couldn't keep any heat."
He looked around the warm, calm lodge, his eyes wide with disbelief.
"We thought we were dead. We saw your chimney smoke."
It was the only thing we could see. Elias gave them blankets and hot coffee. He put their frozen boots and coats near the fire. He checked the baby, who was miraculously still alive, protected by her mother's body. They huddled together, staring at the steady flame, listening to the muffled howl of the wind. They were looking at Elias not as a madman, but as a savior.
"How did you know?"
Miller's wife whispered, her voice full of awe. "I listened," Elias said simply, adding another log to the fire. The storm raged for another day and another night. The Millers slept the sleep of the utterly exhausted, the sleep of those who had been snatched back from the edge of the grave. On the fourth morning, Elias awoke to a profound silence. The deep hum of the wind was gone. He waited a few more hours, then heaved open the door. The sight that met his eyes was one of utter annihilation. A mountain of snow was packed against the door. He had to tunnel his way out. When he finally broke through to the surface, he was met by a world transformed. There was no land, only a rolling, endless sea of white under a brilliantly clear, cold sky. The sun glinted off the snow with a painful intensity. Of the Millers' fine two-story house, nothing was visible but the top few inches of its stone chimney. The rest was buried beneath a 20-foot drift. Their barn had been completely obliterated. Elias saddled a reluctant Copper. The horse sank to his belly in the soft powder. The journey to Prosperity, normally a 30-minute ride, took 3 hours. It was a journey through a graveyard. He saw the frozen carcasses of cattle, half buried in the snow. He saw homesteads that were little more than indistinct lumps in the white landscape. The town was a disaster. Roofs had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Houses on the north side of the street were buried up to their eaves. A silence of shock and grief hung over the settlement. Men were digging, their faces grim. They were not digging for survivors. He saw Sheriff Miller standing by the ruins of the general store, its roof caved in. The sheriff looked haggard, aged 10 years in 3 days. When he saw Elias riding up, leading the Miller family behind him, his face was a mixture of astonishment and shame. He walked over, his feet crunching in the snow. He looked at his cousin, alive. He looked at the wife and children, alive. Then he looked at Elias. He took off his hat, holding it in his frost-bitten hands. "Thorn," he said, his voice cracking. "We were wrong. We were fools. And we were proud." He gestured to the devastated town. "We lost 12 people. The Henderson family froze in their beds. Old man Hemlock, his roof came down." He looked at the mound on the hill in the distance, a wisp of smoke rising from its chimney into the still, frigid air. "Thorn's Folly," we called it. He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "It seems the folly was ours." In the years that followed, the story of the Great Freeze became a defining legend for the territory. It was a harsh lesson, written in ice and loss. And at the center of the legend was the quiet man who had listened to the land. Thorn's Folly was renamed by the survivors. They called it Thorn's Hope. Elias Thorn never said, "I told you so." He did not need to. In the spring, when the great melt came, men from all over the county came to him. They did not come to mock. They came with notebooks and pencils. They came to learn. He taught them how to site a dwelling, how to read the wind, how to build with the earth instead of just on it. He showed them the principles of the arched roof, the cold sink, the baffled chimney. New structures began to appear across the prairie. They were low and solid, hunkered down into the landscape, their green roofs blending with the hills. They were not as pretty as the frame houses, but they were enduring. They were shelters, not statements. When another hard winter came, 5 years later, no lives were lost. Elias lived in his earth lodge for the rest of his days, a quiet, respected figure. He never sought praise and never accepted any official title. His vindication was not in the words of men, but in the silent, life-saving strength of the shelter he had built. It was in the sight of his neighbors, safe and warm in their own earth lodges when the north wind howled. The lodge outlived him by a century. It became a landmark, a piece of local history maintained by the descendants of those he had saved and taught. Travelers would stop to marvel at the simple, ingenious structure that had ridden out the worst storm in living memory. The grass grew thick on its roof, and wildflowers bloomed there every summer. It became part of the hill, a testament to the quiet wisdom of a man who understood that true strength comes not from defying nature, but from yielding to its deepest laws. For in the unforgiving calculus of the prairie, madness and foresight are often separated by a single, terrible storm. The difference is survival.